With Season of the Witch being Hive-focused, and Crota's End returning on Friday, now is the perfect time to talk about the character at the center of both stories, Eris Morn. I want to explore her metamorphosis from light-imbued guardian into something stranger, a half-human, half-hive hybrid. This discussion will contain spoilers for the most recent Destiny lore and the first week of the seasonal story. Eris Morn's story begins with the Great Disaster, an operation where thousands of Guardians descended upon the moon to fight the Hive and retake Luna for humanity. They failed. As they arrived at the Hellmouth, they encountered the minor Hive god Crota, son of the Taken King Oryx. Crota killed many Guardians and forced the remaining Vanguard to retreat. It was such a humiliating and crushing defeat that operations beyond Earth's atmosphere were banned by the Vanguard for centuries afterward. Out of the Guardians who survived, one was named Ariana III, an exo who lost her partner Wei Ning to Crota. Ariana gathered her friends, among whom was Eris Morn, in order to form the first Crota fire team, a group who defied the orders of the Vanguard and returned to the moon. They followed the instructions of a warlock named Toland, who after an encounter with the death singer Iryut, was rended from his physical form and became an orb of light, floating between the ascendant plane and the material plane. Toland had studied the Hive extensively and was banished from the last city for his embrace of the Hive, the darkness, and the Hive religion, the sword logic. Toland attempted to guide the first Crota fire team and help them defeat Crota, but he failed. The Deathsinger caught the fire team and experimented on many of them, learning the nature of the light by tearing it from the Guardians' bodies. The Hive defeated the first Crota fire team soundly, except they failed to kill Eris Morn. Eris was saved by her ghost Brya, who sacrificed herself in order to make Eris lightless, so she could escape the Hive and hide in the tunnels of the Hellmouth. Eris found herself hopeless, trapped, and unable to see. Desperate, she made a wish to an Ahamkara bone she had acquired during the Great Ahamkara Hunt. She wished for the gift of sight, to be able to see in the pitch-black abyss of the Hellmouth. The Ahamkara bone granted this wish, granting Eris 3 green Hive eyes, allowing her to see in the darkness. Eris survived for years in the Hellmouth and studied the Hive. Her hatred and desire for revenge only grew as she suffered further. Eventually, she escaped and returned to the last city. Many in the last city distrusted Eris due to her appearance and deep knowledge of the Hive, but she eventually became friends with the warlock vanguard Ikora Rey. Eris even eventually became friends with the Queen of the Awoken, Mara Sov, who greatly valued her Hive knowledge. In the events of the Dark Below, Eris called upon the Guardian to get revenge by killing Crota once and for all. The Guardian traveled deep within the Hellmouth to Crota's throne world and killed him within. Upon learning of his son's death, Oryx became enraged and traveled to Sol, where he engaged in a war with the Awoken and Guardians. With the guidance of Eris, the Guardian was able to kill Oryx within his throne world and defeat him permanently. Eris returned to the fore of the story once again in Shadowkeep, where she guided the Guardian and helped them vanquish the nightmares caused by Nezarec's pyramid ship, which had been unearthed by the Hive in the crust of the moon. Eris and the Guardian defeated the nightmares and made contact with the commander of the pyramid fleet, the Witness, who gave Eris the power of the darkness, stasis. The Guardian would eventually acquire this power on Europa during Beyond Light. Eventually, the Vanguard learned what Eris had said all along. The darkness itself was not the enemy. It was a tool that could be used to achieve the Vanguard's goals. When the Hive goddess Savathun, the Witch Queen, gained the light, Eris and Ikora led the fight to defeat her within her throne world, which the Guardian eventually achieved using both the darkness and the light. Savathun was trying to protect the Traveler from the Witness, who nearly killed it during the first collapse. Shortly after Savathun's death, the Witness returned to Sol and defeated the Guardian, then teleported inside the Traveler to enact the final shape, the destruction of the Traveler. On the path to discover how to enter the portal and stop the Witness, the Guardian and the Vanguard discovered that Savathun held the key to enter the portal, so they begrudgingly contacted Savathun's ghost Imaru to resurrect an ally ally with her to defeat the Witness. Amaru revealed that Savathun had planned for this very scenario and left instructions for Amaru to only comply with the Vanguard if they solved the problem for her, defeating Savathun's younger sister Xivu Arath, the Hive goddess of war. The Vanguard agreed and followed Savathun's instructions to create a ritual to transform Eris into an ascendant Hive witch, whom they could empower using the blood tithe system of the Hive and the sword logic, so that she could become strong enough to defeat Xivu Arath. Upon her final transformation into a Hive witch, Eris became the Harbinger, one who brings destruction. She aims to accomplish the same thing she's done twice before: vengeance upon a Hive deity who has taken those she cares about away from her. Now that you're up to speed on Eris's story, I want to dissect it. I've always found the concept of metamorphosis in fiction fascinating, and Eris is no exception. It's pretty much impossible to do any kind of analysis of metamorphosis in fiction without at least mentioning Franz Kafka's 1915 novella, The Metamorphosis. The novella is the most famous example of a story containing a character undergoing a non-human transformation, and partially why the term metamorphosis is commonly used to describe this literary device. I'm going to use it as a lens to explain the concept of a metamorphosis and what it means for a story before we dive into analyzing Eris's metamorphosis. If you're unfamiliar with the novella, its first sentence gives a pretty succinct explanation of the core premise. The translation I read while working on this video reads as follows. One morning, as Gregor Samsa was waking up from anxious dreams, he discovered that in bed he had been changed into a monstrous vermin. Because the metamorphosis was originally written in German, the translations vary, and sometimes the word vermin is replaced with insect or bug, as the rest of the story makes it apparent that Gregor has undergone a metamorphosis to become some kind of giant insect. In this context, the word metamorphosis directly refers to a kind of biological transformation common in nature, where an animal undergoes a significant physical change between its birth, child, and adult forms. Kafka twists this concept to create a horrific effect. What if you went to bed one night and woke up the next with the body of an insect? It's unsettling to think about. As a literary device, metamorphosis is frequently used to convey a deeper meaning through symbolism or metaphor. Horror staples like vampires, werewolves, and zombies all involve an otherwise anatomically typical person being transformed into a new form. The reason metamorphosis is a useful literary device is that it can be used as a stand-in for all kinds of change, whether it be social, political, economic, or even personal. Many creators have used metamorphosis to this effect, ranging from the George Romero zombie movies to Stephenie Meyers' Twilight series. Because metamorphosis is inherently symbolic, different people can come away with completely different understandings of what the text represents. For example, if you look at the Wikipedia page for the Metamorphosis, you can see a number of different critics' interpretations of the story, each of which has its own merit. How each critic interprets the text tells you just as much about that person as it does the work itself. To illustrate this, I'm going to explain my personal interpretation of the novella. When I read the Metamorphosis, I see a metaphor for disability. The first chapter of the story fixates on Gregor being unable to get to work on time as a result of his new body. As he wakes up, Gregor realizes he's late for work. His internal monologue reveals that he's the sole provider for his family. His parents and younger sister rely on his job as a traveling salesman to support them after the failure of his father's business and resulting debt. Gregor is motivated to get to work by a desire to provide for his family, so he contorts his insect body to try to get out of bed, but it takes all the energy and control he can muster. Gregor's manager arrives at his family's apartment to see why he hasn't shown up for work, so Gregor uses all of his strength to unlock his door and let his parents and manager into his room. When he succeeds, all hell breaks loose as the other people realize he no longer appears human. The manager flees and Gregor's father shoos him back into his room. Upon realizing Gregor's inability to return to work, his family starts to care for him, and each takes a new job to make ends meet. They even rent out a room in their apartment to try to help continue their current lifestyle. Gradually, the Samsas grow used to the situation and begin to neglect Gregor and see him as a nuisance rather than a member of their family. Unable to feed himself or survive on the food he's being given by his family, Gregor's health begins to decline until he dies, upon which the family takes a day off from their jobs and celebrates being rid of the insect that they had stopped seeing as Gregory, given his inability to meaningfully communicate with them. An important aspect of the story to me is that not only does Gregor change at the beginning of the story, but his family changes in response to Gregor's metamorphosis. Gregor's inability to work and the way that changes the life of his former dependents is very reminiscent of someone developing health problems that cause a sudden inability to work. I personally have a few chronic disabilities and have had them interfere with my ability to work or attend school in the past. My disabilities don't completely prevent me from being able to work again, but they do sometimes make me unable to work for extended periods or require significant accommodations to continue working. This causes a lot of stress and anxiety for me, as I'm afraid of losing the ability to work again and being unable to support myself financially anymore. In our culture, we expect adults to be able to continuously work to make money in order to survive, but many people are unable to do enough work to support themselves. This can range from being able to work inconsistently, only being able to work part-time, or never being able to work. This creates a situation where we must depend on other people like family, friends, or the government to survive. Our culture highly values able-bodied people who are able to provide income for a company, their family, their community, and themselves, and as a result looks down upon people who don't fit this criterion, which is called ableism. I've internalized this to an unhealthy degree and have long struggled with my self-esteem, particularly when I'm unable to work as a result of my disabilities. This leads to me worrying that I'm a burden upon those around me, or that my struggles with disability are not bad enough to make me worthy of help. I related heavily to Gregor, as he's unable to survive without the support of his family and dies as a result of their neglect. To me, the Metamorphosis is a story about the ableism of capitalism and the inability of individuals to survive without support from their community. If you've read the novella, you might disagree with my interpretation, and that's okay. That's the thing about interpretation. It's completely subjective. Interestingly enough, destiny is something that has helped me cope with my own disabilities in the past. Last year, due to some health issues I won't elaborate upon, I was unable to work during the summer and the fall. Falling in love with Destiny in the late summer was incredibly helpful because it helped distract me from the struggles of my day-to-day life. It made coping with my circumstances easier, and I'm incredibly thankful for that. Even now that I'm working again, the game still provides a great source of entertainment and socialization for me, which I appreciate massively on nights and weekends. I know I'm not the only one who's been positively affected by the game in that way, so before I got into Eris's Metamorphosis, I wanted to pause and take a moment to thank Bungie for giving me that experience. Now that we've broken down Kafka's Metamorphosis, let's apply this analysis to Eris's Metamorphosis. Eris is transformed twice, once in the Hellmouth, gaining Hive eyes, and a second time in Savathun's throne world, gaining the body of a Hive witch. Metamorphosis is an integral part of Hive lore, dating back to the Books of Sorrow from the Taken King. It tells the story of three sisters who undergo a transformation into the three major deities of the Hive. They create a new species and grow in power from their transformations. Like their gods, many lesser Hive undergo metamorphosis themselves. This makes sense, as Bungie was likely inspired by real insects when creating the Hive for Destiny. Hive are born from eggs and then take the form of Thrall. The most powerful Thralls survive to become acolytes, and the most powerful acolytes survive to become knights or wizards. Wizards are able to become pregnant either by self-fertilization or from a knight mate. Once they've been fertilized, they lay eggs and the process starts again. Ogres are special, as they may undergo a third metamorphosis at the hands of wizards who perform magic rituals to transform them. Some ogres are even genetically engineered before they're born to create the strongest ogre possible. Oryx himself underwent 2 stages of metamorphosis. He began life as Arash, the Krill, then became Oryx, the Navigator, and finally claimed the power of the deep, becoming Oryx, the Taken King. Savathun herself has undergone 2 stages of metamorphosis. Eris. She started life as Sathona the Krill, eventually became Savathun the Hive goddess of cunning, and finally removed her worm, died, and was resurrected as Savathun the Lightbearer. The third sister started life as Shiro the Krill and became Xivu Arath the Hive goddess of war. She hasn't undergone a second metamorphosis, but I suspect she might by the time her story is over. Perhaps she could be taken by the Witness or undergo something even more terrifying. It's narratively fitting that Eris undergoes 2 stages of metamorphosis, just like all other Hive, which casts her as a foil for her Hive enemies. She's more like them than she might like to think. Eris's first metamorphosis allows her to use the magic and tools of her enemies against them, but maintain most of the appearance of a human. Eris's second metamorphosis is much more drastic, removing much of her human appearance and allowing her to fully use all of the powers of the Ascendant Hive, the Sword Logic and Blood Tithe, which allow her to increase her personal power by drawing on the accomplishments of her acolyte, the Guardian. Eris becoming a Hive goddess is the natural conclusion of her character arc. She's using the power of the Hive against them to the most extreme degree we've ever seen. Season of the Witch's lore so far paints an interesting picture of how the metamorphosis has changed Eris and what it has left the same. Eris has a much different disposition after her second metamorphosis. Usually she's fairly subdued but extremely serious, except for occasional outbursts of anger. In her Hive Witch form, Eris's anger is fully unleashed. She frequently screams and shouts at her enemies and begs the Guardian to feed her tribute. In the lore, she explicitly states that she's always been this angry, but has suppressed it around everyone except Ikora and Mara. Nobody else has ever seen her true rage until now. In the past, Eris's anger has allowed her to perform great feats of Hive magic. What it will allow her to do now is uncertain, but I certainly wouldn't bet on Xivu winning the upcoming fight. After Eris's first metamorphosis, she wears a wrap over her eyes to protect them from the bright lights of human habitats, but also to protect her companions. Much like Gregor in the Metamorphosis hides under the couch to spare his family from having to see his body when they bring him food. The true body horrifies the companions of both characters. During her second metamorphosis, she takes off the wrap, signifying that she's done hiding what she is from her companions and is going to fully embrace her true nature. While Eris's first metamorphosis was all about surviving and living with trauma, her second is about revelation, showing us her true nature and rage. Ikora worries that Eris may not be able to come back from her second transformation. Eris brushes Ikora off and shows a disregard for her own safety, much like she threw herself at the Hive as part of the first Crota fire team. Elsie Bray mentions that Eris Morn was one of the Guardians who was consumed by the darkness and turned against the Traveler in the previous dark timelines she's visited. This could potentially foreshadow that Eris herself may become a threat to the city once Xivu is dealt with. I love Eris as a character and hope we don't have to fight her, but it would be tragic and very thematically resonant if we did. Without seeing the conclusion of Eris's story, it's hard to say for sure exactly what it represents, but I have a theory. Upon defeating Xivu, Eris would potentially become the most powerful Hive to ever exist, which she may not be able to handle. If Eris does succumb to temptation and is corrupted by her power, her story will represent the cycle of violence inherent in revenge. When you take revenge and kill a person because they killed someone you cared about, you don't only affect that person. You affect everyone who has ever cared for them, and they may seek revenge upon you. There's a famous saying related to this: an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. It means that you won't solve your problem by seeking equivalent retribution and will only cause further escalating violence until everyone has lost. Eris helping the Guardian kill Crota as revenge for the death of her fire team and Ghost is a perfect example of this. She only caused further violence and destruction as Oryx arrived in Seoul incensed and killed and destroyed countless people before Eris had him killed too. Eris was the harbinger of death for Crota and Oryx, but also for her friend Mara Sov and countless humans Awoken, Elixni, Cabal, and Vex during the Taken War. I see no reason to believe that she won't succeed in destroying Xivu Arath, or at least trapping her in her throne world, but I can only wonder what further violence the destruction of Xivu will bring, likely at the hands of the Witness and their followers. I find Metamorphosis fascinating, likely because I personally have struggled with a metamorphosis of my own. I'm trans, so the first puberty I went through was incredibly distressing for me. It was as if my body was turning into something alien or horrifying before my very eyes. Only later was I able to undergo a second, medically induced puberty that allowed me to have a body that I'm more comfortable with. As a teenager undergoing my own first awful metamorphosis, I related heavily to stories that featured the trope, as they were an outlet for me to fantasize about a second positive metamorphosis that would be better. However, the actual process that healed me was imperfect, so I still find myself yearning for something slightly better, a past or body that will never come to pass. I still gravitate towards fiction featuring metamorphosis and relate to both Eris and Savathun, hoping that one day I will be able to achieve a more perfect form. It's a bit strange, but I find comfort in seeing characters like Eris and the Hive undergo multiple stages of physical metamorphosis because it shows me that I'm not alone in my experiences. Even if your metamorphosis wasn't physical, we all have undergone changes in our lives, so know if you're grappling with change, you're also not alone. I hope that can provide you with at least a little bit of comfort. If you've enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. I make videos about the Destiny franchise and particularly its lore in my free time, so if that's something you're interested in, there will be more videos like this one in the future. I'm eforme and I would like to thank you for watching.